Hi, my name's Steve Bartlett, and welcome to Fight Back. Tonight's episode is going to be about not the Mueller report, because nobody has seen the Mueller report except one person. Instead, what we're going to be talking about is the Barr memo. So in case you guys don't know, and I know that you do know, I'm going to say it anyway, after Special Investigator Mueller finished his report, he submitted it to the Attorney General, Mr. Barr, and Barr sent over to Congress a memorandum in which he did a summary of what he believed what the Mueller report actually said. Now, before I begin, I have never, even though I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, I voted for Hillary, before that I voted for Bernie, and I can't stand Donald Trump, I have never, ever called for his impeachment. Why? Because I believe in the Constitution, I believe in democracy, and I believe that impeachment should only be used when a person has been proven to have committed a crime. You should not just use politics to remove people out of office if you don't like them. So during the investigation, I have never called for the impeachment of Donald Trump, never since the day he was elected. You can go read my blogs and whatever I put on Facebook. Although I criticize the president, I have never called for his impeachment. However, after reading this memo from Mr. Barr, there's a lot of things that I think are very odd and very unusual. And I read this, because I'm an attorney, I read this in a very clinical way, very carefully, and I noticed that things were written in a certain way that made me just hesitate, and I want to describe what I think based upon reading this memorandum. But before I get to that, I want to talk about a couple other things. I want to talk about the law that is in place in this particular case, because a lot of people haven't been hearing about it. Instead, television, whether you're on the left or the right, is just basically with explosive headlines saying that Trump has been cleared by the Mueller report, or Trump is completely innocent and is vindicated, and he's done a victory lap trying to say that. But based upon the information we have, that doesn't appear to be the case. So I want to go through the statute, I want to go through the law, and I want to go through the facts, and my opinion as to what everything means. Okay, now, the purpose of the investigation is actually put into the Barr memorandum, and according to Mr. Barr himself, the Attorney General, the report of Mueller is involved with two basic things. The first one are allegations that members of Trump's campaign and others associated with Mr. Trump conspired to interfere in the election or sought to obstruct the federal investigation. So the two things they were looking at is conspiracy to interfere in the election and obstruction of justice. That's what the memorandum of Mr. Mueller is about, according to Mr. Barr. Okay? Now note, that's only two issues. So any type of criticisms or any illegal activities that Trump has been accused of doing, whether it's tax fraud or money laundering or any other types of crimes that he may have committed, none of that is actually part of the Mueller investigation. That's not part of the report. If there was something that was found by Mueller during his investigation into conspiracy or obstruction, that would have been referred to another agency and would not be included into the Mueller report. Okay? Now, even though Trump likes to say that this was a witch hunt and that there was no merit to it, and if he had his way, there never would have been any investigation whatsoever into Russian interference, that has been debunked because it is incontrovertible that the Russians did, in fact, attempt to interfere with our elections, that they did actually try to put their finger on the pulse of American elections and try to get Trump to win. That not only did they interfere, but they were actually trying to help Trump. This is incontrovertible. There is no arguing against this, regardless of what Trump said. And actually, Barr actually talks about some of the things that the Russians actually did to try to interfere in the elections. Two main things that were actually being done. The first one is they had something which we can call a troll farm, in which this organization called the IRA, the Internet Research Agency, which was an organization created by Russian intelligence, tried to engage in a pattern of identity theft, creating false stories, Twitter buzz, controversial issues, and a smear campaign on Hillary Clinton in order to affect the election. And that they had all these people who were paid trolls sitting in a room actually creating fake accounts to try to interfere with our election. Okay, posing as fake Americans and making false stories and fake news and creating controversies and buzz on things like Facebook and the other internet. The other thing that the Russians did to try to interfere in the elections was they did the computer hacking, where they hacked into emails and then used WikiLeaks to try to hurt Hillary's election campaign. So the Russians did that. So that's what Mueller was actually looking into. And it's a good thing that he did this investigation, because it actually came out that the Russians were trying to interfere in the elections, and whether Trump had anything to do with it or not doesn't matter. What matters is that we have to do something to stop that from happening in the future. Now, I want to talk about a couple statutes that a lot of people haven't talked about. There's a federal statute, 600.8, which deals with the responsibilities of the special counsel. What was Mueller's job? What was he supposed to do? Well, according to this statute, 600.8 federal statute, at the conclusion of his work, and he's considered to be a special counsel, he is to provide the Attorney General a confidential report explaining two things. One, why he prosecuted who he prosecuted, and also something called a declination decision. And what a declination decision is he's supposed to explain why he did investigations of other people but chose not to prosecute them. So look at these important words. First of all, it goes to the Attorney General. It doesn't go to Congress, doesn't go to the public, it goes to the Attorney General. And it's confidential. And it's supposed to explain in detail why he prosecuted who he was supposed to prosecute and why he chose not to prosecute other people. Okay? That's what Mr. Mueller's job actually was. Okay? Now, there's another statute, and that statute is 600.9, and that talks about the duties of the Attorney General once he receives that report. And what the Attorney General is supposed to do, Mr. Barr, is supposed to do is he's supposed to notify Congress that the special counsel has finished the report, and he may, the word is may, determine if public release would be in the public's interest and the extent that that release would comply with applicable legal restrictions. Now, this is very important. What does the words public release mean? Well, public release means release to the public, okay? It doesn't mean Congress. Now, Congress has a special right as their constitutional ability for oversight to actually look at this report, okay? All the Attorney General has a right to do under the statute is to limit the release to the public, not to limit the release to Congress, because Congress has a right, based upon the constitutional role of oversight of the executive branch, to actually get to the bottom of things as well. But the Attorney General does have a right, exclusive the right, to prevent the public, including you and me, from ever seeing Mueller's report. Now, he actually talks about what his intents actually are in his memo that he wrote to Congress. He said, and I'm reading this word for word, he said, "I believe in the public interest to describe the report and to summarize the principal conclusions." That's the only thing that Attorney Barr, the Attorney General, believes is in the public's best interest, just a description of the report. That's all he said that we're entitled to, is a description of the report and his summary. So even though there's a lot of news right now saying that he's working on changing it so that he can give it to Congress, and that's what he's going to do with a public report, that's not his intention. His intention is for America never to actually see the report and only for it to be for Congress's eyes only. Now, the purpose of this report, this is supposed to just be a summary, but the purpose of the summary, he said in it that he wants to come up with the principal conclusions. But conclusions aren't the meat and potatoes of Mueller's report. It's the why. Why he came up with his conclusions is what Mueller was supposed to talk about. Why he chose to prosecute who he wanted to prosecute and why he chose not to prosecute other people. And if we only hear his conclusions and not the why, then we're getting a disservice and the public will never know exactly what Mr. Mueller's reasons were for doing what he did and choosing not to do what he didn't do. The other thing which is important is the misconception of public. Barr wants to redact and put blackout over a lot of portions of the Mueller investigation when he gives it to Congress. He doesn't have the right to do that. Okay? He can control what he can release to the public, but Congress is not the public, and they're using the terms interchangeably, as if when he releases it to Congress, that is his public release. That isn't his public release. They have a right to see it unredacted because of their role of being able to give oversight to the executive branch of the government. Okay? He can make it so that the public can never see it. That is his discretion to do it. But he can't just sit there and say that he's going to redact it and give only what he wants to give to Congress. That's not his role. The other thing is, his role, according to that statute, isn't to give his own opinion about guilt or innocence, but merely to give a summary to Congress. But instead, Barr overstepped his statutory duties by actually coming up with his own conclusions about the president's guilt for obstruction of justice, which he says Mueller did not say one way or the other what Trump did to obstruct justice. On his own, the Attorney General decided to say that the president's innocent of obstruction of justice, even though he never should have done that in this memorandum. All the memorandum was supposed to do was to summarize what Mueller actually said. And there's a big problem with him overstepping that bounds because of the fact that he had already given his opinion before he became Attorney General about the investigation. He doesn't believe that a president under any circumstance could ever be charged with obstruction of justice. So he had a bias going into the office, and he should have, under the ethical rules for a prosecutor, he should have recused himself from that decision-making. If he thought that the Justice Department should make a call as to whether or not the president obstructed justice, he should not have been the person who made that call. He should recuse himself, since he put in writing before he ever became the Attorney General that under no circumstance could a president ever be guilty of obstruction of justice, which goes against mainstream law. So he was being very political when he put that in his memorandum to Congress. He shouldn't have done that, but that's what he did. But let's talk about the Mueller report and the Barr memorandum. The Barr memorandum. This is it. This is the entire thing. I printed it up. Here it is. It's 4 pages. 1, 2, 3, 4 pages. And the first page, half of it is just people who's on the mailing list. The Honorable Lindsey Graham, the Honorable Gerald Nadler. That's it. That's the entire memorandum. That's all that the Attorney General thinks that the public should be able to see about Mueller's investigation. Mueller's investigation used 19 lawyers, 40 FBI agents, intelligence analysts, forensic accountants. They issued 2,800 subpoenas, 500 search warrants, 500 witnesses were interviewed. The report is hundreds of pages long with tens of thousands of supporting documents. And yet, this is what the public gets from the Attorney General, Mr. Barr. In fact, if you read this summary, there's only 2 sentences that are quoted from the actual report of Mr. Mueller. And they're not even complete sentences. There's less than 50 words that are used from the report of Mr. Mueller that is concluded in this actual summary. And the one that got most of the headlines is the quote from the report that Barr says he took word for word from Mueller's report, that the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government. Let me repeat that. The investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government. Now, when I read this report or this memorandum by Mr. Barr, I read it as a lawyer. And lawyers are very careful with words. Words are everything. And we twist and turn words and we spin things. That's what we do. We argue things in court. We try to take things out of context and put a little spin on it. That's what all lawyers do. And any lawyer who reads this Barr report would see that it's written in a very legalized method, and that he's very careful and very selective with the words that he uses. Okay? So what does he actually mean? Let's break down that sentence. The investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government. Notice that the word collusion isn't mentioned. The word instead is conspire and coordinate. And he was it's very noticeable that he used the words conspire and coordinate, because collusion is not a crime. That's just some word that the media made up to describe the entire scandal. Conspiracy would be the crime if there was a criminal act involving collusion with the Russians. It would be considered to be a criminal conspiracy. Now, Now, people have been charged with criminal conspiracy involved in the, by Mr. Mueller involving this investigation. There's actually been indictments for conspiracy. The conspiracy are currently only against Russian members of the team that did the hacking, which did the troll farms. And it actually defines what is meant by criminal conspiracy. You can actually read the indictment if you want to go online. Specifically, what Mueller accused the Russians of doing was knowingly and intentionally conspiring to defraud the United States by impairing, obstructing, and defeating the lawful functions of government through fraud and deceit for purposes of interfering with the election process. That's the conspiracy that the Russians have been charged with. But according to the Barr summary of the Mueller investigation, there's no evidence, or that, I'm sorry, the investigation did not establish that the Trump campaign conspired with the Russian government, so they weren't part of that conspiracy, okay? He also defines the definition of coordinate by saying that it's defined as having an agreement with the Russians. In other words, a quid pro quo. Now, anybody who's an attorney can tell you, any prosecutor will tell you that it's very difficult to prove a criminal conspiracy, okay? And the reason why it's so hard to prove a criminal conspiracy is you have to prove that there's been a nexus between the different elements of the crime. For instance, let's talk about bribery. There was a guy named Bob McDonald who was a Virginia governor, and he was found guilty for taking bribes when he was governor. I think it was Virginia. I think that's where he was, Virginia. I might be mistaken. Okay, and it got reversed by the Supreme Court, even though there was evidence showing that he took money from donors and then gave legislation exactly what the donors wanted. So, you know, common sense would say, yeah, he was bribed to give them what he wanted to do. The problem is proving the nexus, proving that it was a quid pro quo, that the reason he gave them the legislation he wanted was because of the money that they gave him. And that's the hard part about proving that there was a conspiracy between the Trump administration and the Russians. Just because he may have gotten help from the Russians, or they may have aided him, and just because he then he changed the platform to make it more favorable to Russians after he received help from the Russians, and just because Trump decided to lift sanctions against the Russians or do whatever, okay, you can't prove that the two are related. It's almost impossible to prove that the reason Trump did what he did was because of the help that he got during the election, okay? It's very, very hard to prove a criminal conspiracy if that's the facts that actually occurred, okay? Now, notice that it doesn't say that there was no collusion, okay? It says that there was no criminal conspiracy, and it's different. In other words, you can collude without it being criminal conspiracy. You can try to work with some people or be on the same side and try to deal or have contacts or schmooze without it being criminal conspiracy, okay? Now, what does the word establish mean? The term says the investigation did not establish. Establish makes it seem as if there's some sort of burden of proof that has to be done. Okay? Does that mean that there's no proof beyond all reasonable doubt that there was criminal conspiracy? Or does failure to establish mean that there's no probable cause that there was any type of criminal conspiracy, or that there's not even reasonable suspicion? What does the word establish mean? Establish is generally what a jury would say, will come up with an establishment of the facts. To prosecute, all you need is probable cause. So was Mueller saying that there's no probable cause that Trump did anything wrong, or just that we can't prove it beyond all reasonable doubt of criminal conspiracy? We really don't know what his word meant by the term established. Does that mean that if there's multiple elements of a crime, when there's a criminal charge, you have to prove all the elements of a crime beyond all reasonable doubt? Does that mean that some of the elements of criminal conspiracy were proven beyond all reasonable doubt, but there may be one or two that haven't been proven beyond all reasonable doubt? Maybe that nexus between a quid pro quo relationship between the Trump administration and Russia, there might not be proof of that, but that doesn't mean that there's still not something there. Okay? We don't know exactly what that means by failure to establish means. Okay? Now, we do know that the Trump people did work with the Russians and there was collusion. We do know that, not because of the memorandum of the Attorney General, but because of another indictment that was made earlier in the case. In the indictment against the Internet Research Agency, the IRA, that troll farm that I talked about, Mueller put in the indictment. I'm reading exactly from what Mueller actually put in the indictment. He wrote that the Russian defendants communicated with, and here's the word, unwitting individuals of Trump to seek to coordinate political activities. So Trump's people did collude with the Russians, but he called it unwitting. Does that mean that they didn't know that they were Russians when they were colluding with them? Did they think that they were Americans, or did they think they were just regular Russian citizens but not part of the Russian government when they were working with the IRA? We don't really know what that means, but we do know that the Russian government was working with Trump's team, even though Trump's team didn't know that they were being, I guess, Russian stooges, working with the Russian government when they were actually trying to coordinate political activities. But that's what Mueller actually put in his indictment. Mueller actually said that Trump's team did communicate and coordinate political activities with the Russian IRA, which did the troll farms. So they were working together, but for whatever reason, which we don't know yet, it was considered to be unwitting. Maybe one reason that Trump doesn't want the report to be public is that even though they may not have done anything criminal, they did something reckless and did something stupid, because you have to do it intentionally. If you accidentally colluded with the Russians, if you're too stupid to know that the people you're dealing with are the Russian government and that you're being a stooge and you're doing Russia's bidding, but you're too stupid to know that, it wouldn't be a crime, but it would still be something that is important for the public's interest and would also be something that weighs very heavily on whether or not Trump should be reelected president or not. Okay? And there's a lot of other things that could be done. Like I said, it's really hard to prove a conspiracy to commit, like bribery, for instance. The other thing that would be hard to prove from a legal standpoint is the stuff involving Roger Stone. If you recall, Roger Stone is accused of having knowledge of the leaks of the WikiLeaks when the Russians hacked the Democratic emails and then used WikiLeaks to release it to the public. Roger Stone, person associated with Donald Trump, had knowledge of the release before it was actually released. So a lot of people are sitting there saying, oh, that's proof of the collusion, that's proof of the criminal conspiracy. However, in my opinion, it really doesn't show that, because the crime isn't the release of the stolen documents. The crime is stealing the documents itself. So in other words, if Trump and Stone conspired with the Russians to do the hacking and to actually steal the emails, then that will be a crime very similar to the breaking in of Watergate by the burglars under Nixon. However, if they didn't conspire to actually do the hacking and the Russians just did it on their own and then decided to release it through WikiLeaks, then even though we don't like WikiLeaks and we think WikiLeaks is sleazy and everything else, you know, once items are stolen, if it's released through the press, that's legal. During the New York Times versus United States 1971 case, when Daniel Ellsberg was able to release the Pentagon Papers, you know, New York Times couldn't be prevented from releasing it. And the same way the New York Times, they didn't steal the Pentagon Papers, they just released the Pentagon Papers. So if Stone didn't know about stealing the emails and just conspired with the release of them with a media source such as WikiLeaks, that wouldn't be a legal criminal conspiracy. Even though it's very interesting, they might not be able to prove that he knew about it ahead of time or that the Trump knew about it and conspired with the actual hacking of the emails, even though they may have known about the release through WikiLeaks. Like I said, there may be tons of evidence out there. There might be lots of reasons why Mueller chose not to indict, but we really don't know what those reasons actually are. Okay? One thing that could have happened is that Mueller could have simply run out of time. Okay, something that people haven't even talked about is that under the statute, the federal statute 600.8-2, it says that the Attorney General shall determine whether the investigation should continue. Is it a coincidence that Barr, who became Attorney General on February 14th, 2019, Okay? Almost exactly to the day, 1 month later, was when the Mueller investigation was shut down. A month later. Was it shut down voluntarily, or did Barr, exercising his authority under that federal statute, tell Mueller to wrap it up, that he had 30 days to do his report, that the investigation was over? We really don't know. We really don't know whether that actually happened or not. But what we do know is that the report specifically says that, he actually quotes Mueller, who specifically says that the report does not exonerate Trump. It does not exonerate Trump. Now, they've been interpreting it, the media's been interpreting that meaning that he's not exonerated of the crime of obstruction. But that's not what Mueller said in his report. The actual report says, while this report does not conclude that the President of the United States committed a crime, it does not exonerate him. It didn't say that the President of the United States committed the crime of obstruction. It said committed a crime. That meant Mueller said he's not exonerated of any crime whatsoever. See you in 2 weeks.